American copyright law originated in 15th century Britain, along with the invention of the printing press. As books started to be mass-produced, a way to regulate them was also newly necessary. The Licensing Act of 1662 was established for this purpose. Although this act lapsed in 1695, it laid the groundwork for the world's first copyright law, the 1710 Statute of Anne. This is the act that established many of the ideas in copyright today, such as the author's ownership of intellectual property and a fixed term of protection for copyrighted works. But it was still far from the copyright laws of today. For one, the term of protection was much shorter, a mere 14 years, with renewability as long as the author was still alive. Currently, copyright protection generally lasts the life of the author plus 70 years. However, the biggest difference is probably in the view of intellectual property rights themselves. In 1710, a work had to be registered to be considered copyrighted, and it would have to be assigned to a publisher in order for the author to get paid. This reflects not only a difference in law, but also in ideology. Today, copyright is automatically granted. Almost anything created by anyone is considered to be their intellectual property, because intellectual property is now seen as a fundamental right. The first instance of copyright in the U.S. is in the Constitution itself. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the U.S. Constitution is titled Intellectual Property, and states that the Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. Note the use of useful arts in there. This was first ratified with the Copyright Act of 1790, which functionally wasn't too different from the Statute of Anne. However, barely 40 years later, the act would be revised and the term of protection would increase to 28 years, with the possibility of a 14-year extension. From the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, countless more adjustments would be made through both court cases and revisions, once again extending the term of protection and establishing an international copyright bill. 1976 would bring about the biggest revision to the Copyright Act yet, covering a multitude of things, such as reevaluating what constituted copyright infringement, and adjusting copyright registration, notice, and more. Most importantly, this act brought about a very important aspect of copyright today, the fair use doctrine. In 1998, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was passed. This act marked the beginning of a new age of licensing and intellectual property, the digital age. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act offered more protection to many websites and online spaces, but the most controversial was deceptively simple. It prohibited gaining unauthorized access to a work by circumventing a technological protection measure put in place by the copyright owner, where such protection measure otherwise effectively controls access to a copyrighted work. Basically, this is the bill that criminalized pirating. While copyrighted works generally can't be used without the permission of the creator, the one exception to this is fair use. To determine if something falls under fair use, 4 criteria are taken into consideration: the purpose, the nature, the amount, and the market effect. The purpose of the use is, well, the purpose. Why and how is this copyrighted work being used? Ultimately, non-commercial, educational, and transformative uses are more likely to be considered fair. The criteria of nature is directly related to the purpose of copyright itself, to promote creative expression. So more creative uses, like books or movies, are more likely to be considered fair than things like news reports. The amount is just what it says on the tin, the amount of copyrighted material being used in a given work. Similarly, the market effect is also pretty straightforward. It's the effect on the market of the original creator. If the use of copyrighted material directly competes with or would have a substantial effect on the market of the original creator, it's much less likely to be considered fair use. The thing about copyright is that it's a constantly shifting field. As the perception of what deserves to be intellectual property shifts, so do the laws. In the original 1790 Copyright Act, only books, maps, and charts could be copyrighted. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that things like prints, music, and theater were also considered intellectual property, and visual arts didn't come until 1870. And just like how the birth of photography brought a storm of litigation, the popularization of the internet brought about a new age of copyright, and the next great upheaval is already visible in the horizon. Generative AI. According to the National Library of Medicine, generative AI is a system of algorithms that can find patterns and can create new outputs based off of the data it's trained on. This technology is a revolution in many fields, as it can be trained to do things like create or fix coding, organize spreadsheets, and more. However, issues arise when it comes to copyright. Since the majority of AI is trained on some amount of copyrighted material, the output must be considered fair use to be legal. But is AI fair use? When we look back to the 4 principles of fair use, we find that things get a little complicated. Out of quantity, nature, purpose, and market, more than 2 of those factors are often against generative AI. In terms of nature, you might recall that that factor is directly related to how creative the usage is. For a work to be put in a database, like it is with AI, isn't very creative unless you do something that's specifically creative with said AI. Not to mention Thaler v. Perlmutter, a 2023 case that ruled that human involvement in the creation of a work is necessary for acquiring copyright. You would think that given the incredible amounts of data that AI consumes, that copyright quantity would be one of the principles that AI often violates. But actually, for most generative works, the amount of any given copyright piece in the final product is infinitesimal, with the value of each image amounting to maybe a certain pixel placement, or maybe a line placement, all tiny, uncopyrightable things. Of course, when AI attempts to mimic the art style of a specific artist, all of that goes out the window. A recent trend going around on social media has led many people to ask OpenAI's ChatGPT to recreate images in a Studio Ghibli style. But soon after, OpenAI would update ChatGPT and block additional requests to mimic said style. The answer as to why comes pretty easily after looking over the fair use doctrine. The quantity aspect we just discussed only applies where the amount of copied material is so small as to be insignificant. As such, AI-generated works mimicking a specific creator completely shatters that defense. Combined with the other factors of fair use, Studio Ghibli actually has a solid basis for a lawsuit if this trend were to pick up. Not to mention, Hayao Miyazaki, the creator of Studio Ghibli itself, was also famously disapproving of AI, even calling it an insult to life itself. An important note to bring up is the importance of AI. Many people, especially artists most affected by the rise of AI, might be tempted to just toss the whole thing out. Is AI really worth all this trouble? Despite what mainstream media would have you think, AI stretches well beyond creative subjects and could end up completely revolutionizing fields like healthcare and science. Already, AI is heavily utilized in our everyday lives through things like the GPS or facial and voice recognition. Some argue that AI is inaccurate and prone to bias, but if that's truly the case, then we should be providing AI with more material to learn and improve, not taking it away. It's undeniable at this point that AI is the future, and it's coming for us whether we like it or not. This isn't something we can run from. The last 2 aspects of fair use, purpose and market effect, I've saved for last because they might be the most difficult to determine. After all, how can you make a single judgment for either of these across whole fields of AI, all accomplishing different purposes and with different resulting marketing effects? How do you compare a free text-based program like ChatGPT or Grok with AI animation like that seen in Coca-Cola's 2024 Christmas ad, or even things like, once again, facial or voice recognition software? To lump them together under the simple umbrella of AI seems misleading at best and wildly inaccurate at worst. At the end of the day, generative AI is a new technology, one we don't yet have the legislation for. This isn't something that can be worked out through court cases, but an issue that will need a unified approach in the form of a bill. Going by the current standards of copyright, it's likely that while training AI mostly wouldn't be penalized, the output of said AI could be. At the training stage, there is no market effect, no provable quantities in the non-existent final product. The purpose could be more favorable as well, so long as you're not commercializing the AI. A system like this could be beneficial to both sides of the argument, as artists would have less concern over being replaced, and developers could continue to train their AIs. This, of course, does come with its own problems, though. For one, AI companies aren't blind. They see the writing on the wall in the form of the litany of cases that are currently being brought against them, some from big name companies like New York Times. Many AI companies now engage in a practice known as data laundering, where they outsource the training of their model to a research institute or university. The fact that AI was trained by academic researchers and nonprofits helps in the purpose aspect of fair use. Another issue is cases like the SAG-AFTRA strikes, which arose against video companies as a result of them wanting the option to train AI off of their voice actors, potentially replacing them. In cases like these, a potential solution would be to prioritize market effect when the subject in question is a person's livelihood, as it is for the case of voice actors. This could also be applied to roles like animators or artists. Copyright itself is an incredibly intricate system, and AI is no simple subject either. The piece I'm making right now is a perfect example of that. Microsoft Designer, the program used to generate the image I'm recreating in real life, had to have gotten its data from somewhere. It's highly likely that photos of models like these were what allowed AI to create this, but despite the uncanny resemblance, none of the actual models I'm using are similar enough to be considered a copy. Allowing the training of AI, but penalizing the usage when necessary isn't a perfect solution, but it doesn't have to be. Even the 1998 Digital Millennium Act holds rulemakings every 3 years as a response to the constantly shifting nature of the internet. No matter the decision, we still have many years of litigation to come as we round off the corners of the next age of intellectual property. But as long as our base is solid, things will sort themselves out in the end.